Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. Please join Barbara Comstock, Bill Kristol, Katherine Miller, and Janet Rodriguez, all former Sine Institute Fellows, as we discuss policy, politics, and predictions for Sine's Summer Series.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to be together with you all here for the third installment of our Summer Series and the look ahead, which I'm sure everybody is looking forward to. We've got students coming back in the coming weeks to campus. Young people are going back to school, and it's election season at its height. What we're dealing with is 82 days before the election, but people voting even before then. I'm honored and just so thrilled to be joined by, as the introduction mentioned, some of our great collaborators that we've had. Today joining us is Bill Kristol, who's a political analyst and founder of the Weekly Standard and editor-at-large at Bulwark. We also have with us former Congresswoman Barbara Comstock, Katherine Miller, who's the founder at Table 81, and Janet Rodriguez, who's currently head of internal communications at WhatsApp and a former White House correspondent. Now, differing opinions, differing perspectives, differing backgrounds, but the common thread that I think maybe is the most important for all of you is Sine Institute Fellows. So I am so appreciative of you joining us again. You are so well liked and respected on campus, so it's so great to have you with us today. We are at the precipice of another midterm election. As I said, 82 days out. We have in the Senate 14 Democratic seats up, 21 seats that are Republican that are up. 32 of the 34 seats were up in 2016. So it's amazing how this is the class of the Senate that we're looking at, and what'll be the control of that narrow margin. Certainly the U.S. House is going to be a big topic of conversation today, as all seats are up and several of them are targeted, and the primaries have really kind of pushed what kind of election we're looking at, for the House. In gubernatorial races, 28 Republican seats, 22 Democratic seats, and in the state legislatures, if you can believe, there's 88 chambers and 46 states up. All of these individuals voting soon to determine what our leadership structure is. So we want to, hear your perspectives. First and foremost, I want to encourage anybody who is joining us today to ask questions throughout. We're not waiting till the end to have questions. If you have questions, specifically as the conversation is going, and to my colleagues that are joining me today, this is a conversation. So we'll ask some questions, but if you want to have follow-up between individuals and peers, let's definitely just talk this through. But I guess the first thing I'd love to do, welcome everyone, is give you a few minutes to just give a general perspective of what you're paying attention to. What do you think's at stake? I think we'd love to start with you, Barbara, certainly as somebody who's been in the seat of many of these members that are up for re-election. What are you thinking about these midterms? So what are you focused on?
Well, I think, we know that, the majorities are made in the swing districts and the swing states. While the focus has largely been on primaries to date, and in the case of Republicans, sort of this Trump vengeance tour that he's been on, or Trump trying to pick these extreme election deniers or otherwise extreme candidates, we now move into the fall where being a Trump extremist is less valuable, particularly in these swing states. So as I look at it, so hey, great, you can get a primary, but if you're Christine O'Donnell or Richard Murdoch, Todd Akin, or Roy Moore, those are 4 Republicans who lost in pretty reliably Republican states at that time. Winning the nomination, did not make them a senator. So we already have candidates like Dr. Oz, who's been failing spectacularly. He was a Trump-endorsed candidate, first-time candidate, who wasn't living in Pennsylvania. And John Fetterman, his very liberal opponent, has trolled him excessively on, not being in Pennsylvania, being absent. And it was just moved to lean Democrat today. So he's failing in the polls. He's failing in money. And, recently the NRSC took out money. Blake Masters in Arizona, as well as J.D. Vance, are both candidates that Peter Thiel, a Trump millionaire, decided he wants to play and buy some senators. So these are 2 that he's brought in, again, inexperienced, not good retail candidates. Blake Masters particularly is double digits down in the polls. Very extreme candidate across all fronts. We can talk about that, but I think if you're Mark Kelly, sitting on the kind of money he is, he's a lot happier these days, although the whole governor's race there is crazy. The whole ticket, and Republican ticket in Arizona, is an election denying ticket that I oppose as a Republican. J.D. Vance, as I mentioned, Tim Ryan, Democrat, is doing much better than expected. And then you have Herschel Walker, again, Donald Trump, who lost the House, the Senate, the White House, and then the 2 Georgia seats, is the gift that keeps on giving to Georgia Democrats. Herschel Walker, there's an ad up now about his former wife talking about a gun at her head, and all the problems there. And he's just been a terrible candidate too. Fortunately, on the state front, you did have Brad Raffensperger and Governor Kemp defy the Trump attack. But, so you see there's 4 seats there that are not looking great. And then you even have in Wisconsin, Ron Johnson, who always has a tough race down in some recent polls. I wouldn't, that always goes back and forth. But so the Senate now is looking more likely to stay in Democrat hands. Different story in the House, although I do expect, like most, that you're still going to see the House gain seats and get into Republican hands. It's not going to be the huge sweep that they were talking earlier. They thought it was going to be more like 2010, 40, 50, even 60 seats. People were talking about this huge red blowout. I do not think it's going to be that. And the number one reason is, instead of having your number one issues being the economy, Biden's poor ratings, inflation, gas prices, education concerns, crime, Trump is back in the front seat driving the clown car for so many Republicans. And that, if you are in a swing seat, that is a nightmare. Having been in a swing seat when Trump was driving the White House clown car, and it didn't matter what your numbers were, Trump's numbers were, after the 2018 election, you could go and look at whatever Trump's negative numbers were. That's what the Democrat got, almost to a T.
Yeah.
My negatives were not what Trump's were in my district.
Right.
But that's what was the gift that keeps on giving. So as numbers, or actually the policies, are doing better, you're seeing Democrat candidates outrun Biden numbers in the swing districts. I think it's largely because of this reappearance of Trump. The fact that while Trump's problems are increasing, I know he's, and we'll probably talk about Liz Cheney, while he's been so happy on his vengeance tour going after Liz and others, he's ignored the fact that he has increasing legal problems. And as we've seen from 60 cases that he took after the 2020 election, Trump does very poorly in court where truth and facts matter. So he's now entering the factual legal portion of his problems. And today he had guilty pleas from his CFO or lawyer up in personal business, and you're going to see I expect to see indictments of White House and lawyers and people coming soon, and perhaps even Trump himself. So that is going to have an impact in these swing districts, largely because in the House, and much more so than the Senate, like Todd Young in Indiana, he's not running around talking about Trump. He's running around that he passed the CHIPS Act. He worked on a, infrastructure bill, and that he was part of the gun compromise. He's going to sail to re-election. He's a great Republican candidate.
Yeah.
You're a House Republican. You have been linked by leadership to Trump's, everything stupid Trump does. And that's now going, if the Democrats aren't totally asleep, that's going to be wrapped around your neck, because that's how House Republicans had played this.
Right.
Cheney's, going to be opposing election deniers, as am I. So I think that's going to play out. And then I think you have abortion looming out there, particularly where it's going to be on the ballot, say in Michigan. Mm-hmm. I don't think the gubernatorial candidate will do well. And I think that beat Peter Meyer. I do think if the Democrats aren't totally asleep at the switch, they should be able to take him out. And other candidates like that who won in these swing districts are going to be big money sucks if Republicans decide to give them money, because they have less money, because Donald Trump is also sucking all the money out. You've heard about how he's so happy he raised all this money in the past week. Well, that's money that's not going to Republican candidates. The people protesting down in Mar-a-Lago aren't getting you a single vote in a swing district. So Trump reappearing at this time is an in-kind contribution, both financially and vote-wise, to Democrats in the House as well as the Senate.
Well, Barbara, as always, you gave a really great overview. I will have to say that if you look at past lives, we've got a battle almost of the research directors here, right? Barbara, you led the research team for President Bush's campaign in 2000. I first met Katherine Miller, and everybody knows her so well with the Sine community for her work in food policy and everything that she's done. But she also wore the hat of research director at the DCCC in 2000, where I met her. So we're going to have you go next, Katherine, and kind of give us an overview about what you're thinking about how things are right now.
I don't have much to disagree with Barbara on in this case.
We're already building consensus.
We're already building consensus here. I mean, jokingly, I would say that we should all be eating crudité and not with salsa. I think that, the ability for Democrats to capitalize on some of the fits and foibles of the Republican Party, the missteps, the personal problems, the challenges, and the ties to an extremist arm that, I think sometimes doesn't believe the world is round, right, is I think gonna pay dividends on the Senate side, but that to say on the Senate side, we are always looking at voter protection efforts, right? I also designed the voter protection efforts for the DSCC for a number of cycles, and that, we look at this momentum and we look at policy conversations and we think it's going well. And then, there are always efforts to prevent people from voting legitimately. And we saw the strength of the indigenous population in Alaska. A Democrat made that runoff, and that was largely on the strength of the Native populations there. So I think, we can look optimistically at the Senate, feel that is changing momentum for Democrats, but we have to keep a strong eye, especially in those rural states, on Native and indigenous populations, voter suppression efforts, and make sure that is, I think that's probably a priority at the committees right now, to look at that, and at the White House. On the House side, a little bit more pessimistic. I mean, going all the way back pre-Tip O'Neill, all politics is local. And I look at some of these places and I cannot imagine voting for some of these candidates. And yet it's happening. I'm from a rural town in North Florida called Niceville. And, the Niceville Republicans and Florida's 1st district invited Matt Gaetz to speak, right? And the high school was like, come talk to us. And it's like, why would you bring this man into a high school, right? And so, it's really, I think the House is a different story. And, I think the thing that I watch as a policy person, especially related to food, and as we move into Farm Bill season, where we're going to write the largest piece of legislation that employs farmers and feeds Americans, who controls the House and Senate agriculture committees? There's no bigger question right now in my mind. And so I'm looking at places like Georgia, I'm looking at places like Michigan, I'm looking at places like Arizona, even Mark Kelly's Senate race and the House races there. I'm looking to see what happened. I mean, Chuck Grassley's going to hang on, with dear life to that Senate seat, but what Iowa and the redistricting in Iowa means for the House races there. So I think, I think it's going to be, the next 82 days are going to be really interesting. We always say that, but there's a lot at play here, and it is national momentum related to issues and challenges, localized efforts, and then we're really going to have to pay attention to voter suppression and voter protection efforts across the country. And then we should all be voting on the issues that we care about. And we see this with, abortion taking a front row. The Supreme Dobbs there really motivated a lot of voters on the Democratic side and on the Republican side. So issues are going to take a play in this election cycle, but wow, it's going to be a ride.
Yeah, and I think in a great way, Katherine, you bring up too, elections have consequences, right? So many of the decisions that we're making in November affect decisions that will be happening at the beginning of the year around policy. I'm going to go to you now, Bill, because I think when I started this job, if any of my Democratic friends knew that one of my favorite things is to go have coffee with you at Compass Coffee, they'd be shocked. But it is, and I've learned a lot from you. So I really want to know your perspective. You've been writing certainly a lot about the elections and what you're seeing, but you've also a veteran of these campaigns and looking at from different perspectives. What are you seeing, and what is really standing out to you?
Well, thanks, Amy, and it's good to be with everyone. And I enjoy the coffees too. I myself have always been more open-minded, and therefore happy to have coffee with sensible Democrats. But that's okay if it shocks. I'm sure it does shock some people. I guess I just pick up maybe on really what Katherine sort of implied, but didn't quite say, which is we are really in uncharted waters. And one reason I think, incidentally, everyone's like, oh, it's very surprising what's happening in the generic congressional poll because it's so different from Biden. Well, yeah, but this is not 2010, it's not 2014, it's not 1994. We have had the Trump presidency, which was unprecedented in many ways. And I'm not even making a judgment here. I'm just saying analytically, empirically, we've not quite gone through this before. 2 impeachments, someone never been in politics before, becomes president, everything that happened, of course. We've had a post-presidency that's unprecedented, with him wanting to stay as head of the party, staying as head of the party, being investigated by the FBI, being impeached but not convicted at the very, very end of his presidency. January 6th, we don't even need to stress, is unprecedented, and the after effects of that, very unpredictable. And I'd say the after effects unprecedented in the sense that many of us expected, well, that might be the moment when finally the party liberates from Trump. And in a sense, we get back to a more normal situation. And that didn't happen, which is kind of, we now take that for granted. But it's really, if you step back and think what we would have all said on January 7th, it's pretty astonishing. So it's a very astonishing and unpredictable moment. And then Roe v. Wade, a 49-year-old precedent, what everyone thinks of it originally and so forth, overturned on a purely partisan, let's call it, a decision that's handed down by judges entirely appointed by presidents of one party. That was not the case, of course, originally with Roe. A 5-4 decision, 6-3 on the judgment, because Roberts would have sustained upheld the Mississippi law, but would not have overturned Roe nationally. So 5-4 on that. 3 of the 5 being appointed by Trump, one of the most controversial presidents in our history. We've just not had this experience. There's zero historical precedent for this. We've had the court be controversial. Obviously, in fact, Brown was extremely controversial. Roe was controversial. Republicans ran against the Warren Court with some success in the 60s and 70s. But we have just not had an election season where this has been central. And it really is an issue. It's not just symbolically interesting. I mean, actual governors are going to make a difference in Michigan and Wisconsin and elsewhere as to what the actual laws on a subject that's of actual importance to a lot of Americans is going to be, So it's not like people, I remember talking to my friends, many of them old friends, pro-life friends, very much minimizing when the Alito draft opinion came out in the spring. Oh, well, it's, everyone always says it's going to be a big political issue. There's some diehards, especially on the pro-life side. It never really matters. It's not going to affect much. It's going to last the boil. It's going to settle down. I mean, It could have happened. It could still happen, incidentally. 4 years from now, we could look back and say, well, it's settled down. We have different laws in different states and so forth. No federal legislation, perhaps. But for now, it's a live and a political issue. And again, so you put all this together and we don't know. I mean, honestly, we don't know. I will say I was early in saying that the fact that Biden was unpopular did not necessarily mean there would be a huge Republican wave. I just thought that I've been through these races, as we all have, where there is the popularity of the president does drive things. And you could argue that that's even more the case with the nationalizing of elections now. On the other hand, certainly Senate races can separate, and voters are also capable of saying, not crazy about Biden, but let's look at the two parties that are competing for control of the Senate and the House and what their agendas are and what their leadership is. And Trump is now, as Barbara sort of suggested, as much on the ballot, at least for now, I'd say, as Biden. I mean, neither's on the ballot, but therefore, let's say figuratively on the ballot. So, I think I was early in just looking and seeing in the polls that the generic congressional ballot, that for people who aren't following this stuff obsessively is, when pollsters simply ask a national poll, usually, who would you prefer controls Congress in the next session, the Republicans or Democrats? And that's been pretty close. I mean, Republicans were ahead by 3 points or so. Now Democrats have probably a tiny bit ahead. Biden managed to sink from -8 to -15 in this year, in 2022. I just looked this up the other day. And the generic ballot has gone in the other direction by a couple of points. So all the conventional, now maybe it'll ultimately work out the way it has in the past. Presidential approval dominates. This is a temporary bear market rally for Democrats. The House, you can't really separate yourself. There'll be tens of millions of dollars Republican ads attaching Democratic House candidates to a reasonably unpopular president. Maybe it'll revert, but maybe it won't, And anyway, but for now, at least, we're seeing pretty unprecedented decoupling of presidential and generic. And I'm very dubious of all the conventional wisdom, even that some of these senators are as safe as people think, or House members. I don't know. Are we utterly confident that it's inconceivable that voters in Iowa will just decide 87 years old for a 6-year term is kind of a problem? And incidentally, for all that they lied, Grassley personally has been to every county 5,000 times. He is a vote for, I think at least nominally, a vote for a national legislation to have very strict restrictions on abortion. I don't know quite what he's certainly pro-life, and I believe he's probably endorsed that at least nominally. And I don't know, is it crazy that, the state does have a Democratic, or has had, Democrats elected, in modern times. I don't know. I think Grassley probably wins, but a lot of these states that people are sort of very cavalier about dismissing, I'll say one thing to students, two things to students. One, people have overlearned the lesson, which is a true lesson, of politics is nationalized, politics is polarized, demography is destiny. You can look at the presidential vote in the last couple of cycles and predict every House and Senate race. And that has been more true in the last decade or two than it was true when I first came to Washington. And there was a huge disconnect between presidential vote and Senate and House vote in the olden days. That has gradually been removed because of a million different things going on in the country, sociologically, economically, culturally, geographically, politically, the character of the parties, nationalization of elections and media and everything else. But it's not, these trends continue until they don't continue, right? And I think people are too quick to say, oh, Florida, that was +3, 2020 Republican. Inconceivable that a Democrat could win an election, a statewide election in Florida. Like, really? In 2018, which was not ancient history, the Democrats came within 1 point of winning 2 statewide, the governor and Senate races in Florida. So I don't know what's going to happen there, but people are just too quick to assume that trends that have gone in states that have moved red or blue in the last 4 or 8 years are just like there forever. And that's why Nevada could go the opposite way of where it's been, and Florida, in my opinion, or states like that could go in the opposite direction. So I think when you're in uncharted waters, some of these trends don't necessarily continue in the same direction. And students should be, I think, they should learn the history and learn the political science. And I have a lot of friends who teach this stuff, and it's usually a pretty good guide until it's not a good guide. But this, if any time it's not going to be a good guide, it's going to be this year. Final point, 2023, which just to look ahead a bit, I take Catherine's point about policy, but it's going to be such a crazy year, I think, that again, who knows what that looks like? What does it look like? Let's say Republicans win the House, reasonably narrowly, as Barbara correctly suggests, is the most likely outcome, and Democrats, let's say, have the Senate. What does it look like when they have hearings on Hunter Biden and try to impeach Joe Biden, and McCarthy is looking over his shoulder, whatever Trump is saying, if McCarthy's even speaker, and at all these other people who will have been elected or reelected, who are screaming and yelling that he has to advance this. What do they do? Do they pass even nominally a restriction on abortion? What does that do nationally? Does every Republican vote for that? Incidentally, I'm not so sure. Does the party start to fracture in all kinds of ways that it has in the past in the House? What does Biden do? Does Biden run for re-election? What does Trump do? Does he announce in the next couple of weeks for re-election? And there's so many variable. Does Trump get indicted? What's the popular reaction to that? They impeach Merrick Garland. I mean, in the House. I mean, I don't know. I just think there's so many moving. To leave aside even Ukraine and the world and the economy and all this, there's so many. It's not going to be a normal. Okay, we've been through this. You lose the House or Congress in your first off year and you cut a deal like Obama did in 2011 with John Boehner or Clinton and Gingrich did in 1995. And we kind of know what the next 2 years probably look like. And it's interesting and important to work out. And there will be a lot of politics as usual. And as Katherine says, it's important to work out what the farm bill will look like. And that matters who controls each house and who the chairs of the relevant committees are. But there could be such craziness in both parties, especially in the Republican Party, but a lot of uncertainty in the Democratic Party, especially if Biden doesn't run again, and all the kind of polarization and the legal investigations and post-January 6th committee sort of developments and Liz Cheney is a very unusual wild card, I would say, in American politics, if you think about it, deciding what to do in 2023. So people should pay close attention, but be very open-minded, I guess is the way I would put it, about how things are going to play out.
I think it's so important, Bill, to bring that up, because I always caution candidates when I'm talking to them, you lose when you're running the race and back at you, not rather than the race in front of you, right? And so sure, there's these indicators, there's these things that traditionally we've seen, losses in midterms, for the presidential party in power, but any one of those things would affect this race in a unique way. The fact that all these are swirling around is unbelievable. And so that's why I'm going to go right to you, Janet. There's nobody who has seen it all firsthand during, the Trump White House as well, and followed that along. As a journalist, as somebody who's, definitely covered, Trump's impact when he was president. It's interesting in this midterm after post-presidency, what impacts he's having. I'd love to hear your perspective and also how news is being disseminated, this cycle as well. So welcome, Janet. It's good to see you.
So I'll pick up where you left with the race ahead, because the race ahead depends on news cycles. And I do believe that news cycles have consequences. And in news, 82 days that we have ahead before the midterms is a lifetime. We're a lifetime away from the midterm elections, right? And we just do not know. There is no way to predict. We don't have a crystal ball of what the news cycle will be a month before, a week before, and even the day before. And we know that people do go to the polls with what's happening in their communities, in their pockets, in their minds right before the elections, and that could swing with world events, that could swing with, scandals and anything that the media has to play those right before the election. So I am watching what's going to happen with the January 6th committee and how is that going to be? Where are they going to be right before the elections? Are we going to have any news from the Department of Justice? Are we going to have any more investigations? We were talking about all the legal troubles that Trump may incur in the future, and how soon is that future, right? So all these things we should be watching closely, and candidates should be prepared to act upon them, because honestly, they have to adjust to the news cycle as they see it coming. So those are, news will happen up until the last minute, and we will react, and voters do react to what happens, as we saw specifically. I'm thinking of Hillary Clinton and the emails and everything that happened in the last election. So we know that, or the previous election. So we definitely need to watch. And I think one thing, if I had to say for journalists, one thing that we also pay attention to is the local races, because historically we know that if we do have a lame duck session, as it seems that it will be for the next 2 years, local elections have real consequences and consequential. They're very consequential in what happens in the next 2 years in our country. So local laws will happen, whoever gets elected, and the legislatures will kind of shape those states for the next 2 years and for many, many years ahead, because those laws could have real, consequences in the populations there, and then those people get elected to Congress at a later time, and so on and so forth. So definitely keeping a very, very close eye into what happens in the states as we look at how that shapes the next 2 years of laws within our country. And one race that I'm really interested in, just because there is an anchor involved, is the Kari Lake Katie Hobbs race in Arizona, which is really
yes.
wild. As you guys know, I used to work in Arizona. I was a colleague of Kari Lake. We didn't work at the same station, but seeing her now, possibly could win the gubernatorial race in Arizona would be really crazy in my mind, but really wild and really possible. So that comes to show you that anything could happen in these upcoming elections, and we should be as Will said, very open-minded that things are not going to be conventional, that things are just going to switch and back and forth, and we just don't know and shouldn't predict anything that may happen in these elections, although we kind of can see the picture on the wall and how things may shape up. But I think we hold it until the last minute, just like we did with the Trump election.
Yeah.
Can I just add one? Just as Janet mentioned her close friend Kari Lake there.
But not a close friend, just a
I'm
colleague.
teasing you. I'm teasing you. Here's a wild card that people aren't talking about. Kari Lake loses by 1 point, let's just say, in Arizona, and it's a little uncertain what election night is. They have a lot of course, their vote is very highly early and by mail, and so we're not sure, and you don't know until 2 days later. Does Kari Lake just accept that? Does she not go on TV Tuesday night and say it's being stolen? Does she have no support for that in the Arizona legislature? Does she have no support for that among certain election officials in some of the counties in Arizona? Do some of them refuse to certify? I mean, the degree of chaos we could have, and I say this with no pleasure because this would be very bad, obviously, for the country. But people have focused, and I've focused a lot, and I think a lot of people have focused on 2024 and how do we fix the electoral college kind of, problems and ways to strengthen those guardrails against 2020 happening again from November 3rd to January 6th, so to speak. But in 2022, we could have this kind of thing happening. Now, I think ultimately, maybe, Governor Dacey doesn't put up with it, and the election Secretary of State doesn't put up with it, and so forth. But what if a Republican has won the Secretary of State in the end, and the incumbent Secretary of State says no, but the person who just got elected says no? I think Kari Lake's right. We need to have who knows what, right? A new counting and then audits and fraudits. I mean, so I think. I mentioned this Lake is so particularly extreme on this, but we could have much more chaos than we're used to. And as I say this with no pleasure, on November 9th and the following weeks and even months after the election.
It's interesting.
On that same point,
sure, Barbara.
One of the things about these Republican candidates that I actually think Democrats are ignoring to their detriment, people like Kari Lake, is these are largely unvetted candidates. Usually in a normal Republican process, Republicans would vet each other and you'd find out what's wrong with them. So you know all of Kari Lake's problems and background. You know all of Dr. Oz's problems in the primary, not in the general. That has not happened with a lot of these candidates because everyone was just vying for Trump's attention. Democrats should be looking at, it's a little late at the game to get it, but I think there's going to be a lot of the unknowns or the surprises that are going to be right there in front of us that that Republicans didn't go after. John Fetterman has been the best example of doing that. The McCormick campaign, I have to say, was pretty negligent in not finding all these things in the Fetterman campaign because they were spending millions of dollars, let's go Brandon, and doing a lot of silly Trump things and vying for Trump's attention, instead of just doing bread and butter, not out, the kooky stuff. So, and I think in Michigan, you got the same situation. Tudor Dixon and the whole crowd, they were all trying to just say, I'm more Trump, I'm more Trump. Who knew she had been like a D horror movie person with silly things out there and the extreme things she had said. So these unvetted candidates that are now being vetted in prime time general are going to make things much more uncertain. And I think in the House races, the Democrats are kind of ignoring that in many cases, assuming like, oh, somebody already checked that out. And given that I'm from Virginia, where people didn't find, remember the KKK and blackface picture until after the election, I say to anybody out there, you know, if you're not doing your basic bread and butter stuff right now, shame on you, because these candidates that have come up in the Trump world are totally unvetted. They're not just extreme and bad candidates, they are vetted personally.
Yeah. It's funny, Katherine, I see you nodding and bursting at the seam a little here. I don't know if you had something to add. Is this another place that you're in consensus with Barbara here?
Yeah, and I want to let Janet in here too. I think there's two things. I mean, I think Arizona is actually the state that I am going to pay in somewhat the most attention to in this cycle. You have the competitive Senate race. I mean, Mark Kelly, there's so much money going in there to protect that seat on the Democratic side. You've got open seats on the House side. You've got the governor's race and the Secretary of State. And you have exactly what Bill said, which is election deniers. And you also have a native population. The Navajo Nation there delivered 12 to 13% of Biden's vote in the presidential race. And that is going to be a place where people are going to try and discredit that vote. They're going to try and prevent that vote. And so that is going to play right into the election denier. So I think, you know, if this is, I don't even think it's 1 point. I think she goes on, if it's 3 or 5 points, she goes on and says it's all BS, right? And she contests it just because it is so ripe there. I think Barbara's absolutely right on the side that I wish that you know, more were doing opposition research in that bread and butter way. I am the person who's hugely skeptical about whether voters care about that anymore. We've lived through 2 impeachments. We've lived through multiple impeachments all the way back to the Clinton era. We've lived through fraud, financial fraud. We've lived through, you know, we've lived through so much from a personal foible perspective that I do question or ask the question about whether American voters really are just like, sure, you're going to tell me that and I'm going to tell you he's a nice guy, or sure, you're going to tell me that, but I'm going to tell you I go to church with her. So I wish they were doing it. And I think it does take something like finding a candidate in blackface to break through that, which is unfortunate.
Fetterman's doing that basic stuff. Fetterman's about that he's a Trump person. He's just saying he's odd, he's kooky.
He's odd, he's
kooky stuff.
Yeah.
And he owns 12 houses in a place where, you know, no one owns 12 houses. I certainly think that I just, you know, there's some question in my mind, but I think, you know, this is, as Bill said, this is unprecedented. Everybody should be doing, you know, the committees and the voters and students should be doing everything they can to sort of organize and get involved, because this is, wow.
And this is where I think, I just wanted to add to that point that this is where I think local journalism is so important.
Yeah.
In this day and age, because yes, while people may not be swayed or persuade as much anymore, I think it's up to those local reporters to do that digging, not opposition research, but to really go after those unvetted candidates, to really do the homework, to put it in front of their readers and for the readers to decide, right? But you have to be able to vet them in the press. And yes, there's a lot of people that are not being vetted, and there is a lot of suffering right now with local newspapers or local stations not having the resources to do this. But I think if one advice for the students would be is to go and read your local newspaper every day and really get to know those candidates and have your local reporters go after them and press your local TV stations to do more in terms of doing that vetting if no one else is.
And it's interesting because I think so many candidates are probably looking for ways to localize their race. Either they're a Democrat and don't want to necessarily follow some of the Biden numbers, or there's concerns there. I think the Liz Cheney race is a good example of a nationalized race. And I looked on websites, did research there. I didn't see, you know, her opponent talking that much about what she's going to do for Wyoming or those Wyoming issues. It was such a nationalized race. I will say, Aiden, one of our students had a question. I think, Bill, I'll go to you on this because it's something you brought up about whether or not the Dems are looking better, you know, in the Senate sphere right now. But he wants to know if they are looking better, you know, and for Democratic Senate candidates, how and will this translate to House races? So how much are these Senate races, you know, influencing down, you know, ballot and on the local races, Jana, as you mentioned? It's a good question from Aiden. I'm curious what you have to say.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, just on the point Jana made, which is important. Yeah. I think we all talk about what's caused the current moment, you know, and there are a million different things, as I say, sociological, cultural, media, social media. But I do think the decline of the local press, which is mostly an economically driven thing. I don't think anyone intended it exactly, but it has to do with obviously the internet and the fact that people don't need it the way they used to, has really had a big effect on our politics, and it's underrated. I mean, there are a million things that you could talk about that have had a big effect, and they all have. You know, it's like you can't disentangle them exactly. They all happen at the same time. But the decline of the local press. Now there are local websites. I mean, it was a local, if I'm not mistaken, it was a website reporter, if that's the right term, in Florida, who broke the news about the search. I mean, about the FBI search of Trump, right? I mean, it wasn't, the New York Times, and it wasn't AP, and it wasn't even the Miami, paper and so forth. So anyway, it's a very important point. Yeah. I mean, people need to do their own research locally, and there are places to do that, but there isn't the kind of 1 stop, 2 stop, 5 stop, okay, these are the major papers in this district, and you can, go to them. Same with local news, which doesn't have the clout, I think, that it wants to. Look, I mean, generally what a political scientist, which I once was, would say about the question is Senate races can separate themselves from a national trend. Barbara sort of alluded to this earlier, in a way that House races can't. I mean, people just don't know House races, especially if it's an open seat. They don't know a challenger in a House race. They don't have the money to advertise if it's near a big city, and they'd have to buy the whole media thing there. That's changed a little bit with digital, but not totally. And if a senator's an incumbent, they probably know him. He's been there 6 years, having press conferences about how he's delivering infrastructure for that state, even if he voted against the bill. And they see him. The House person just has a much tougher time getting, gets a little bit swamped by the national and statewide news and trends. So typically, and this is historically true, in 2010, when there was a massive wave, it swept the House from Democratic to Republican in a massive number of seats. But the Democrats held on in the Senate, partly because the Republicans had 2 or 3 really terrible candidates, and just partly because senators can distinguish themselves more from their states. Having said that, the degree of
here, wasn't that Christine O'Donnell? And
yeah. But having said that, the degree of nationalization and polarization, those two things together, should not be underestimated. Tip O'Neill would not say what he had said, honestly. I mean, it's just not true that at the House level, politics is local anymore, as Barbara said. Barbara's right. I live in her district. She was very well liked in this district. People wanted a House to check Trump. Barbara was anti-Trump as a Republican, but it wasn't, she probably wouldn't have voted for Pelosi for Speaker. So she lost in a race where her own she was personally approved of and liked. So, it really is more nationalized and more polarized than it used to be. And that has been true of the Senate. When I came to Washington, one factoid, in 85, I believe I looked this up, I think 26 states had one senator from each party. Moynihan and D'Amato, I mean, just think about almost that many states, including many states that we think of as deep red or deep blue, right? And so half the states had bipartisan Senate delegations, about half had Republicans, 13, and 13 had all Democrats. Now, I think the numbers are 44 states have 2 senators from one party. And almost all of those states also have governor and state legislatures controlled by that party. And only 6 states have 1 of each. Pennsylvania has Toomey and Casey and so forth, West Virginia, Manchin and Capito. And there are only 6 states. Think what that does to our politics. Think what if a majority of the states have a senator from each party, it just changes the whole flavor of what politics is like in that state and what politics is like in the United States Senate. And you can make the same point about House delegations, which used to be much more mixed. And so the polarization plus nationalization has just had such a fundamental effect on our politics. And that has happened. So that has trended that way in Senate races. Claire McCaskill survives in 2012, though she's a Democrat in Missouri. She runs a clever campaign. She's personally popular. She's a good politician. Her opponent has some problems. 2018, she just goes down in the wave like everyone else because Missouri is going red. And same with Heidi Heitkamp in North Dakota and others, and the reverse, incidentally, for Republicans in blue states. Could that reverse? Could that change a little bit this cycle? I kind of think it could a little bit, but that has been the trend over the last 20, 30 years. The Senate has gotten more like the House in its election results over the last 20 or 30 years.
Well, I appreciate that perspective. I'm going to go to another student question. First of all, there's a shout out of hello going to you, Barbara, from your former student associate, Tyler, who's on. So Tyler says he misses you.
Hi, Tyler.
Hello. But I'm going to direct this question at first and would love other people's comments to Katherine, because another hat that you've worn, Katherine, is you have served on the board of the National Abortion Rights Action League. And so one thing that we've got a couple, Tyler and Kevin were both asking, what happened with Roe and the Supreme Court, but then what happened with the vote in Kansas, right? I mean, you see this that had a big, what are these both going to have as an impact? Is Kansas and seeing a state vote, to support abortion rights, like, what is the impact, and what do you see, especially with your experience working with an organization that's dedicated to doing, looking at it state by state?
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it, but we told people this was going to happen for 30 years. In every election cycle, we said at NARAL and Emily's List and Planned Parenthood, listen, like, this is, the Supreme Court's on the line, and when the Supreme Court goes, so does Roe. I mean, the chicken was, the sky was falling. We told everybody and no one believed us, right? And I don't actually think, I truly don't think people believed us until the decision was leaked. And I think that threw the world into a different space in terms of pro-choice advocates and pro-choice campaigning. I have seen more money flowing into third-party groups and independent expenditures on both sides, probably than ever before, related to this. I believe Kansas is a harbinger only for the fact that we're about to have 50 state laws and 50 different state policies. There's no national momentum for, especially even if Democrats retain the Senate and it's a much more narrow majority in the House. This is a 50-year strategy. We're back to rebuilding this from a federal level. And so there's a lot of work being done to figure out the ties for Republican candidates right now to different aspects of different personal aspects, business foibles, missteps, all that kind of stuff, and also tying that to their votes on abortion rights in this country. So, I just think that Kansas was a great example of community-based organizing, community-based. I mean, it was so under the radar. If any political prognosticator had said that it was going to turn out the way I would have just said, you have no idea, right? Yeah. And because it was under the radar, it was locally driven, it was local organizing, and that's what we're going to see. I just think, unfortunately, it probably means that we have 50 state policies, 50 state ballot initiatives, and we are going to have this fight now to protect the lives and health of women around this country for another 50 years. And yeah, but I think Kansas is I do think the plus side for Kansas, especially for Democrats in this world, is local organizing, local community, empowering local organizations works. You don't have to run this from a suite in Washington, D.C. You don't have to, you turn the money over to the states, turn the money over to the people who know the communities, turn the money over to the people who have the faith and trust of their next door neighbor and will be listened to. And maybe that helps turn the tide, because that's what worked in Kansas.
Yeah. Anybody else on those issues? Because we've got a lot more questions too. I think one of the issues that I think strategically people want to know is there evidence or enough evidence that Trump-backed candidates are turning off more moderate Republicans? So if you look at the party as a whole, and I don't know if we've seen anybody reporting on that, Janet or Bill or Barbara, if you've seen any evidence, but that's a big question. Are these candidates that making it through the primary, do they win in a general election with more moderate Republicans, independents? Thoughts on that?
Well, I think that's the problem. Why you're seeing the problem in the Senate with those key races. If you have Doug Ducey running in the Senate against Mark Kelly, I think it would be far more competitive and probably advantage Republican. If Chris Sununu had decided to run in New Hampshire, it would be a competitive race. So Trump running out candidates like that. I mean, Rob Portman would have been sailing to re-election in Ohio, or a Portman-like candidate. So I think the evidence is that's very much in the Senate races. I think it's a little races, because I think with the redistricting, you were able to, in a lot of the states, some of the seats that may have been closer before aren't as close as they were. But, and I think maybe with Kansas as the example, as others, when you have too extreme, you can go right off the cliff. You can be, okay, well, I can be with, Glenn Youngkin is my friend. I voted for Glenn Youngkin. Trump, I'm not voting for, election deniers. So, so like in Virginia, Bob Good, who replaced Denver Riggleman, like, okay, Denver, yes, Bob Good, no. So
Yeah.
I think for a lot of Republicans, I think you see that evidence in the type of, no, unfortunately, that district got a little bit more Republican, so it's not a problem for Bob Good, but the quality that's going to make next year in the House just how you're handling it. You're going to have a lot more Marjorie Greens, a lot more crazy people, like Mary Miller from Illinois beat out Rodney Davis. Sensible, pretty mainstream guy. So we got a kook instead. We got downgrades in a lot of these seats. But that means when you're the Republican leadership and you need to have a budget passed, you need to have something done. You can't shut down the government all the time. You have nobody to go to anymore. There's not that sensible group of people. Hey, just got to get this passed. It's going to be people saying no to everything. And then if, say, you have like an Elise Stefanik in leadership who's already running for vice president, with Trump, she's going to have to say no to everything. So then you're going to get nothing done in the House and have all these extreme, because, we've got enough when we were there, the Freedom Caucus dominated. You're not going to have more of those types there. I mean, if Donald Trump calls up Harriet Hagman and says, hey, I've got Mike Lindell here and he wants to have a hearing on this, they're going to have to go get in the clown car with Mike Lindell and Trump.
Yeah. Well,
a real problem to manage in a caucus.
And that brings up, Jana, I have to ask you, because you brought up January 6th before, is democracy on the ballot? And is this is the first election after, the attack on the Capitol on January 6th. So what are you seeing about, we talk there's policy issues, but is democracy actually on the ballot?
I would think so. And the more we talk about January 6th, closer to the elections, and the more development there is. And like I said, if the Department of Justice gets involved, I think that would definitely play a major role in the elections for sure. And people will vote. Like we saw it in the primaries, where January 6th was a talking point for the media, for the candidates, for the voters. And they definitely went to the ballots thinking about January 6th and how those candidates thought or reacted to it. And I also want to piggyback and kind of flip the moderate Republicans or the moderate Democrats and how and this is happening. I've seen it happen along the U.S. border, with many districts there having turning Republican, and those moderate or liberal Democrats who would have easily won those races are now having to turn more moderate Democrats and more right-wing to be able to stay in the race. I'm thinking of Representative Gonzalez, for example, who even had to switch districts because he knew that he could no longer hold his district in the previous district that he had. So he's running another district altogether, trying to survive there. So it's not only the Republicans, the crazy Republicans turning off moderate Republicans, but also liberal Democrats going to the right to be able to survive the midterm elections, and really knowing that if they don't do that, their lives and their House seats are at stake.
Well, it's interesting too, because you bring up this is a redistricting, election as well. We didn't bring that up as much, but like all those issues you laid out, Bill, at the beginning, that seemed daunting enough. Like, how is redistricting playing? We've got some, members running against members in certain districts. There's been an influence about how are these being drawn that will affect the long term. What are you seeing there?
I mean, on the whole, I think the consensus is that the district redistricting solidified Republican and Democratic districts, as opposed to throwing more up in the air, which has not always been the case, I would say. And so, that probably mutes swings if incumbents found the right district, to run in. I mean, some of them got thrown in with each other, and we'll see what, New York has a kind of colorful race with two long-term incumbent Democrats next week, Jerry Nadler and Carolyn Maloney. But, some of them got knocked off, and some of them are in tougher races because the district isn't entirely people who voted for them. And the reason, redistricting changes the partisan leans of different districts, and B, people sort of forget this, it means that incumbents sometimes have to run in districts where they only had half of before, 2/3 or 1/3, and that a lot of the voters aren't their voters, so to speak. They haven't voted for them before, and they lose the advantage of incumbency for the new voters, so to speak. And this is happening to me. I'm not in the same district I was before redistricting. You know, there's and this is a big challenge for Alison Spanberger. Let's Abigail Spanberger here in Virginia, Democrat, who is running in a district where 80% of her voters aren't people who voted for her before. So she has to spend a lot of money reintroducing herself, which normally if you were an incumbent, you'd spend just kind of taking credit for things and then attacking your extreme opponent. So it does change a lot of the tactics. I don't know how much it changes the overall distribution, so to speak, of power in the House. Of course, the Senate doesn't get redistricted, and we've seen a lot of the same trends in the Senate. I think on the whole, people are a little too obsessed with gerrymandering and redistricting. I'm not happy about gerrymandering, would prefer neutral commissions and so forth, but it doesn't explain quite as much of the changes in our politics as you would think, since the Senate hasn't been gerrymandered in 60 years, and it hasn't changed, the state lines haven't changed, and look at what's happened there. So a lot of it is deeper socioeconomic things, and media, nationalization, polarization, and so forth.
Well, it's interesting. I didn't think of it from the Senate perspective, but one of our second series this summer, we talked to Congressman Will Hurd about a lot of, kind of these issues. He's one of those, interesting districts, down in Texas, Janet. But I'm curious. I really want to know, Katherine, because when we were at the committee, his point was, we are solidifying these DNR districts. There's less competitive districts. And this is why we're getting these challenges, in elections, whether it's, vote turnout, whether it's the candidates that are coming through the primary. But what do you, I can't even remember the number of competitive districts we had when we were there in, 2000. We certainly tried to make a hell of a lot more than there probably were, even, like every day trying to find those. I know I was talking to 80 races every day to see if they, would kind of like, come to be, in a place where they could be competitive. I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, I think he was pretty serious about, like, this is why we are where we are, because there's just not as much competition, challenged incumbents, but then also, new faces coming in.
Yeah. I mean, on the House side, we're looking at a playing field that's really fighting over about 25 seats, right? Out of 435, right? And that is pretty precarious, right? I mean, if you look at some of the models from last month, the prediction of 230 Republican seats after Election Day to 205 Democrats, we're going to, the idea that we would lose that many seats. And it's all playing out in those 20, 25, maybe 30 districts, and all playing out with, localized agendas, localized pieces, some national stuff. I definitely think, there's some question, but this is really a question for, Janet and Barbara and Bill, like that the intensity of the Trump vote is what's so scary, right? Like we all think maybe they're a little nutty or we wish there was a different thing, but like my family are believers, right?
Are they in a purple district? I mean, that's
no, they're in a red district, right?
Yeah,
so thankfully.
That is overemphasized because they scream louder and they tend to hang out at these, they tend to be, it's probably 20%, which means it's a big part of the Republican Party. I mean, if you're 20% of the country who believes this stuff, then that's, a big cancer on the Republican Party. But when they say, oh, this has energized them, they were energized. They're voting no matter what. So the idea that whatever new happens between now and November changes that they're voting. I think the unknowns are, what happens to get the Democrat vote changed or coming out, and what candidates out there are genuinely good candidates of unknown situations that arise.
Yeah, I tend to be a pessimist and think that we are actually a country like sort of governed by the tyranny of the vocal minority, not the silent majority, right? Like the decreasing, the suppression of voters, whether, direct, the idea that, people are disenchanted, so they just don't vote. Like I just feel like, and this is also a midterm. So like, I definitely think that we probably provide too much overemphasis to the super loud, but at the same time, they are on both sides, right? Like the people, the heavily invested on the left will come out in those droves too. It's that I just feel like, I don't know, right? But my personal feeling is there's a little bit of like there's a middle, we have 25, 30 seats that we're going to play in on the House side, both parties pretty dramatically. And the intensity by which we play and what that does in terms of how are people mobilized, or are they just exhausted?
Well,
right?
just on,
at the end of it.
I would say
and on Catherine's point there, if I could
earlier, on the news cycles in the next 82 days, it's like win the day. When you're in these 82 days, going back to 16, I mean, I opposed Donald Trump like when I was on the ballot with him. Access Hollywood tape came, I mean, I hadn't said I'd support him when Access Hollywood came out. I'm out. So I have to go 3 weeks. Life is miserable. I assumed he'd lose and I'd lose, but I wasn't going to support him. Well, what changed was instead of the news cycle every day being Trump, when, thank you, Jim Comey, he comes out and with the Hillary Clinton stuff at the end of October, that changed the news cycle. And our polls changed then. I know Hillary's changed then. Hillary blames the FBI for losing. Donald Trump blames the FBI for losing. I think they're both wrong. I think they were both lousy candidates and they just happened to lose because they didn't understand how to, design a winning campaign from the beginning. But when you're in these very precarious situations with kind of a lot of bad candidates, like I said, news cycle for the next 82 days, it's more precarious for Republicans than it is for Democrats.
But I would just
that win the day is going to be harder for Republicans in swing seats than Democrats.
I think that's right, but I want to pick up on Katherine. I mean, I think 2 points. Politics and history are more contingent than people think, and more path dependent, if you want to use a social science term. And I mean, I don't know. I do think actually Hillary ran a crummy campaign, but probably wins without Jim Comey. So a lot of history changes because Jim Comey makes a slightly random decision that he has to make this letter public in October 28th because he got attacked for not, making other things, doing other things earlier or whatever. I mean, and I agree with Barbara, the underlying, I should have been ahead by 8 points, so it shouldn't have mattered, but still it did matter in the real world. So things, and I would give an example of this relating to our discussion about Katherine's point about Trump supporters. It was a very big deal that the Republicans picked up 12 House seats in 2020. Now they picked back up, in a sense, 12 of the 40 they lost in 2018. So you can sort of say, why is it? But the fact is, people like me wanted to say, and many of my friends were saying, I would say I was actually more cautious and didn't say it, Trump's disaster. You got Trump at the top of the ticket, you're finished. You can't win anything. So they pick up 12 House seats. They hold their own in governorships. I think they actually added a couple of one state legislative chamber maybe. They eventually lose Georgia, but on election night, they're up 50-48 in the Senate. And even with Georgia, it's 50-50. They don't exactly lose like 15 House, 10 Senate seats like in the old days, right? It was very hard afterwards for people like me to make the case, honestly, and it wouldn't have been honest to say Trump has just destroyed the Republican Party. Really?
But those were women and minority candidates who.
I'm just saying. Well, fine. So you know what? And they've recruited even more women. They've recruited even more women in minority. It's a big mistake for anti-Trump people to say inevitably it's all going to fail. And in fact, it's been a problem. But I mean, whatever. It's going to fail in some places, as Barbara says, totally. But not everywhere, and not in the Rio Grande Valley, and not with Trumpist, perhaps, minority candidates or women candidates. And I think ultimately, I do think Republicans will get punished this year for various things, and Democrats will outperform the traditional mid-year election. But I just want to say, as a practical matter, getting back to the path dependency and contingency of history, if the Republicans had lost 10 seats, which is totally within what people expected, incidentally. Everyone ridiculed Trump for saying we're going to win the House, gain House seats, and whatever. He didn't quite win it, but they came pretty close. If Republicans lose 10 House seats in 2020 and lose a couple of these Senate seats they thought were in play that ended up reverting at the end, I think the effect of January 6th is totally different. I don't think Kevin McCarthy, I don't think they rallied it. They did not think, Republicans in the House do not think Donald Trump is a disaster for them. Kevin McCarthy is 3-1 odds to become Speaker of the House in 2022. Barbara can say correctly, what about 2018? And what about this? And what about that? And it's going to be a horrible caucus. But at the end of the day, it's not Florida and Texas, or Texas and Florida, the second and third largest states in the nation. And they're probably going to reelect Republican governors who have become more and more Trumpy and much Trumpier than their predecessors. So they have not, one of the biggest things students, I think people really need to think hard about is, I hope there's a political price to be paid. There's some political price has been paid. But until there's a much more evident political price to be paid for being a Trumpy Republican, and it's not just in rather few swing districts, but it's across the nation, it's, I think, very hard to change the party. Now, I think maybe Pennsylvania and Ohio and Wisconsin and Michigan this year will make a big difference, honestly, and that will be an interesting question then. Does it affect the presidential, races in 23, 4? Does it really strengthen those on the Republican side who say we can't do Trump again? I think it could. You know what? If Gretchen Whitmer wins by 7 in Michigan, and if they win, if Shapiro wins by 8 in Pennsylvania, and suddenly Republican donors are looking at it and thinking, geez, we cannot just go down this path because we've just seen a preview of 24 if Trump is the nominee, that could really change things. But again, the fact that it's an underreported fact that Republicans felt okay about their own party in 2021. Half of them were happy to get rid of Trump, and when they lost the Senate, it got dicey. But they thought they at least had almost they picked up House seats. And it hasn't been as much of a disaster as you would have thought it would have been. I think this is kind of Catherine's point, to be a Trumpy Republican until now.
Well, listen, I'm cognizant of time too here. We've covered policy, we've covered politics. I'm going to go to predictions, like we have to. Okay, so just kind of would love to ask for all of you, and I'll start with you, Janet. Like, can you envision what does the Congress look like after November 8th? What do you think, is going to happen at the start of a major presidential election in 2024? So a little bit of predictions, if you would, Janet.
I think we've all failed at that recently. So
I won't hold you to it. We'll all regroup after November 8th and somebody will get
That's right. I'll go with a consensus. I think the House goes to Republicans, the Senate holds. And I saw the question. They wanted to know presidential candidates for 2024.
Yeah. Do we even know what that, so many dynamics that could happen there. What do you think?
I think Harris versus TBD.
Interesting. Okay. Why don't we go to you next, Barbara? Predictions?
I think the Senate stays Democrat, maybe down 2 or 3. And those will be the Trump candidates doing in winnable seats. Do things, does flip. But then how those swing seats are determined in some of those key states may be impacted by some of these bad Senate candidates too, or bad governor candidates. And then that could have an impact on how things are going forward. I do think that one of the interesting leadership races will be Tom Emmer has announced he's running for whip, who's very popular. He hands out the money for the NRCC.
Yeah.
He's a more collegial person, less, more practical. Elise Stefanik is now announcing that she's going to run. Who wins that race could maybe determine if there's any success at all in the House after they get it.
Katherine, thoughts, predictions? I think you're muted still, Katherine. Or maybe you want it that way. I don't know. Why don't we go to you, Bill, and then we'll come back to Katherine. I think she set it up that way, but anyway.
I guess I'll just revert to my original point. I think surprising things will happen and it'll be more chaotic than we expect. I mean, are we 100% confident that if Republicans win the House by, let's say, a really narrow margin, 5 seats, that Kevin McCarthy is Speaker? Are we confident that Trump doesn't try to depose him with Stefanik or someone else? Are we confident that, I assume if they lose the House, Speaker Pelosi steps down as leader and probably just resigns from the House? Maybe not if it's really close, but she thinks she could really affect things, but maybe she does. I guess we think Hakeem Jeffries is next in line, but we're not certain. We don't know about that. Are we confident with the Democrats? If they don't win the Senate, does McConnell stay, incidentally, as minority leader for another? Maybe he does. Scott challenges him, I suppose. It seems like he wants to. Senator Scott from Florida. I just think the degree of, and right away the question becomes both Trump, assuming he's running, how strong is he, and does Biden run again, which I'm a skeptic about. So again, we have both parties at the presidential level in, disarray is not the right word, just competition, let's say.
Right.
I don't think Harris is a laydown to be the nominee, incidentally, at all. So, and then in this, even in leadership in the Congress, I think a little more chaos than we're used to. So
I would always keep my money on Mitch McConnell. I also think Nancy Pelosi lose the House when they lose the House, and back to Italy.
Oh,
Yes.
okay. I'm writing these all down, Barbara. So just, you know.
Yeah.
All right, Katherine, you're up.
Yeah, I did not plan it that way, but I think the Senate stays in Democratic hands. The House is in Republican hands, but much more narrowly than many are predicting. And I think that we see probably 4 to 5 high-profile recount election, 4 or 5 high-profile, not decided on election night races, and that's going to stoke a lot of these things and make the landscape of the 2024 presidential even more unpredictable and unprecedented. I also do not think that Harris is a shoo-in, unfortunately. I would love to see our first woman president set up. I'd love to see our first woman vice president set up nicely to be the first woman president of this country, but I don't think that's going to happen. And so I think the primaries on both sides are going to be, to use Bill's word, unprecedented. So yeah.
Well, and so many factors to determine that. So I appreciate
the
that.
Should all get involved and be out there.
Yes.
We can make a difference in these 50-50 races.
Well, this is what I was going to say next, Barbara, to finish it out. What is your advice to all the students that are on here about there's as we've laid out, there's so much at stake, there's so much going on, there's so many factors. Like, how do you have impact? How do you make a difference? What would you advise them?
I think regardless of party, get involved with candidates that you believe in, people who are, principled and that, you want to follow and work for them. And particularly in these 50-50 districts and in what are close elections and determining majorities, where you work there, you can really make a difference. And don't get discouraged. And, if you're in a district like Bill and I are now, that's like a 30%, Democrat district, there's only so much you can do. But if you're up in Pennsylvania, boy, jump in, and there's a lot of races to play in there. Michigan and Arizona, but you can make a big difference in Arizona, engaging in those races and getting those election deniers. We can all agree on that.
Right. Janet, what do you think that for our students on
the journalism front? Like I said, read your local papers, stay on top of your local issues, those who really matter in the next 2 years. So make sure you read the national news and the CNN and Washington Post of the world, but really stay on top of your local issues, because those will dominate your lives and will have real impact on your house and households in the next 2 years for sure.
Thank you, Janet. Katherine?
Go work on a campaign. I try not to hire anybody who hasn't worked on a political campaign, at least at some point in their life. And if you live in a place like I live in Washington, D.C., I will not be spending election day in Washington, D.C. My vote and my energy is not necessarily needed here. It's needed in other places. So if you're in one of those bubbles, go get outside that bubble and take 10 of your friends with you.
Great. Bill?
No, I very much agree. Vote, first of all. Vote.
Yeah.
Since if you're an AU student, you probably don't need to vote in Washington, so vote in your home district and state, and those could well be competitive. And to pick up on Barbara and Katherine's point, our district now, Barbara's and mine, is not competitive, but we're only 50 miles from 2 competitive districts. Well, from Spanberger's district, which is competitive, and maybe 100 miles from Luria's district, which is competitive. And there are state races which matter a lot, to pick up on the theme of Janet. So yeah, be involved. I very much agree with the campaign experience. For me personally, coming to Washington and not having been that involved in campaigns and then getting thrown into the political stuff after being in government a little bit, I learned a ton from campaigns. And I think especially young people have great opportunities to make a difference, but also just learn a lot about themselves and about politics and about America by being involved in campaigns.
Well, some people are dropping off. We've been able to answer some of the questions, from our students. I can't thank you enough for your time. You're all incredibly busy people, but the impact that you've all individually made to the Sine Institute and American University, what you've done so far would have been enough to come back and do this. Jenna, I know you also serve on our advisory board, so I thank you for your voice on that. You are always welcome on this campus. Yes, the Sine Institute is going to ask you again and again to bring your voices to these conversations, and we always will. But I want to thank you, and we'll all get together maybe afterward, and I'll bring my piece of paper with those predictions, and we'll see how it goes. But I'm sure there will be a lot of discussions about this election, because I will close it just by saying, with Katherine's point about the Farm Bill coming up, elections have consequences. So these are not just competitions for competition's sake, you know, I mean, they do have ramifications. And if campaigns are about contrast, government is about consensus, or should be about consensus. And so we will bring you all back and talk about what is the new landscape, and you know, how are we going to navigate that as a country when it comes to all these issues. But I appreciate all of you. I look forward to talking to you between now and Election Day. And thank you again for supporting Sine and our mission. To everybody on, we're going to have welcome back students. They're coming back to campus, and we're so excited to have you here. We have incredible fall programming to give you more information about the elections, and certainly you can't get better advice from all of these individuals about how you can have an impact. So please do so. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone, and we'll be in touch soon. Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.